Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Kamal Singh, Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, Central University of Himachal Pradesh, Dharamshala. Today we are going to discuss on the module Public Finance Introductory Issues from the paper Managerial Economics. Now the learning objectives of this module are to understand the meaning and the scope of public finance, what are the different functions of the government, then what is public expenditure, public revenue, and public debt. Public finance, in its layman language, can be understood as the study of government's revenue and expenditure. According to Professor Dalton, public finance is concerned with income and expenditure of public authorities and with the adjustment of one to another. According to Harold Grover, a field of inquiry that treats on income and outgo of governments, federal, state, and local. In modern times, this includes four major divisions: public revenue, public expenditure, public debt, and certain problems of fiscal system as a whole, such as fiscal administration and fiscal policy. Now let's see what is the subject matter of public finance. The subject matter of public finance can be classified as number one, public revenue. Public revenue refers that how the revenue is collected. Revenue simply means that income to the government. How the revenue is collected and it's generated in the most efficient way. The different type of taxes, tax rates, and tax bases. What is the meaning of incidence and shifting of direct and indirect taxes, and the effect of various taxes and their analysis. Similarly, public expenditure. Now, once the revenue has been generated, the next big issue in front of the government is to spend this revenue. Though the functioning of the government are umpteens, but the resources are scarce or they are less. So, public expenditure relates to principles and problems of allocating the resources under different heads. There are various canons and principles governing the optimum allocation of revenue. The expenditure should be done in a way as to minimize the wastage and optimizing the welfare. Then public debt. Most of the time, public expenditure exceeds public revenue. So, to bridge the deficit and for other different needs, government restores to the policy of public debt. It refers to loans which the government, center or state raises to meet the deficiency or contingency from different sources. Then finally, the financial administration. Financial administration is related with the methods of administration, controls and problems relating to preparation of budget, its various types, processes, etc. In other words, how the financial function of the government will be carried is the matter of financial administration. Main functions of the state or the government. Now let us discuss what are the main functions of the government or the state. Theory of public finance divides the functions of states into three broad categories: allocative, distributive, and stabilization. Under allocative function, the resources which are at the disposal of the government are limited, and the function of the state or the duties which the government has to perform are numerous. These give rise to problem of scarcity and choice. The allocative function of the state decides to allocate the scarce resources in different areas or for different activities. For example, making provision for private and public goods. How much resources should be diverted for providing public good and how much for the private good. Second function is distributive. Distributive function of the state emerges from the contention that in the free market, the distribution of income and wealth is unfair or it is unequal. Market cares for only those who can pay the price for the good, and the others are excluded. This principle leads to inequalities in distribution of income and wealth. Under the distributive function, the government interferes in the market by the process of taxes and subsidies and try to bridge these gaps of income and wealth. Third function is stabilization. For economic growth and prosperity, it is quite important that key economic variables should be stable. The government intervenes in the market to ensure steady growth and to maintain low inflation, leading to lower unemployment. The government attempts to achieve this role through monetary and fiscal policy. The aim is to get stable prices, stable growth, and full employment. Major aspects in public finance. One of the major aspects in public finance is about public expenditure. Public expenditure in layman language can be called as the expenditure which the government is undertaking. So, the public expenditure refers to the expenditure which is undertaken by the government on the various activities which are directed toward the welfare of the people and for the economic growth. Public expenditure is necessary for the promotion of trade and commerce, building infrastructure, development of agriculture industry, regional growth, and for providing gainful employment and for other various activities. Principles governing public expenditure. While undertaking public expenditure, numerous considerations are to be kept in mind. Governments should have the objective that there is minimum wastage in the process of expenditure. There are numerous wants, needs, aspirations of the people from the government, but the resources at the disposal of the government to fulfill them are relatively scarce. So, while undertaking the public expenditure, government should be extra careful. There are different principles, canons, which the government should follow while undertaking public expenditure. These principles, oblique canons are: number one, principle of maximum social advantage. The theory of maximum social advantage is given by Professor Hugh Dalton. According to Professor Dalton, the best system of public finance is that which secures the maximum social advantage from the operations which it conducts. It simply discusses that when the government undertakes certain activity, there is some sacrifice which people have to bear, which is called marginal social sacrifice. Similarly, there is certain benefit which the society receives, which is called marginal social benefit. According to Dalton, the economy achieves maximum social advantage when the marginal social sacrifice is equal to marginal social benefit. In nutshell, it describes that the expenditure which is done by the government should have minimum burden on the people and people should get maximum benefit. Second principle is the principle of economy. According to the principle of the economy, the government should spend the money in such a way that the wasteful expenditure should be avoided. The principle of sanction. According to the principle of sanction, all public expenditure which is incurred should have the sanction of competent authority. The sanction is necessary because it helps in avoiding waste, extravagance, and overlapping of public money. Then the principle of balanced budget. The government should strive for maintaining balanced budget. The budget should neither be surplus nor deficit. It simply refers that the government should neither overspend nor underspend. Then the principle of elasticity. According to this principle, the government expenditure should have built-in flexibility. It means that it should not be rigid. As and when need arises, it should have flexibility to change. For example, in case of recession or slowdown, it should be possible for the government to increase the expenditure so that economy can be lifted from the grip of recession. Then, no unhealthy effect on production and distribution. The public expenditure should be such that it should not have adverse effect on production or distribution of the wealth. Public expenditure should rather provide impetus for production. It should strive for reducing the inequalities rather than concentrating wealth or income into the hands of few. Public goods. There are different categories of goods which are studied in economics, like normal goods, superior goods, inferior goods, given goods. But the special type of goods, public goods and merit goods, occupies an important place in public finance. Public good in general sense means goods and services which are provided to the public by the government at subsidized price. But in economics jargon, not every good provided by government is public good. It should have some characteristics to become a pure public good. The important features of public goods are: number one, non-rival in consumption. Public goods are non-rival in consumption, which means once the public goods are available, they are available to everyone in equal amount, and consumption of public good by one person does not diminishes the amount of the good available to other consumers. This feature of non-rival in consumption extend to the fact that the marginal cost of providing the good is zero for additional consumer. Because of this principle, it is inefficient to exclude consumer from consuming the public good, or exclusion principle is not advisable. Second, non-excludable. This principle propounds that once the public good is produced, the individual who do not pay the price cannot be excluded from the benefits of the good or service. Examples are street lights. Once the street light is installed on a road, everyone will enjoy the benefit of the light, and there is no way to exclude a person from receiving the benefit of street light. Pure and impure public goods. Public goods can further be classified as pure and impure public goods. A good which has both the principle of non-rivalry and non-excludability is pure public good. Example, lighthouses, street light, national defense, etc. On the other hand, some public goods can be partially rival or partially excludable. They are called impure public goods. Example, cable television. The consumption by one consumer doesn't diminish the amount available to another consumer, but the cable service provider can charge the fee for providing the connection, or the consumer who doesn't pay for cable connection will be excluded from this benefit. That means his consumption is not non-rival, but he can be excluded, or the principle of excludability can be applied to him if he doesn't pay the price for cable connection. Now let's discuss the case of merit goods. The concept of a merit good is given by Richard Musgrave. These are those goods which are not distributed by the means of price system or market system or the demand and supply basis. As in the case of merit goods, it is believed that they will be underconsumed by people because of lack of knowledge or otherwise. Similarly, the market forces will undersupply the quantity if left to market. So, government mostly produce them and provide to the people. These are those goods which are provided on merit. Unlike the nature of public good, which is non-rival and non-excludability and zero marginal cost to additional user, merit goods are partially rival and excludable, and they exhibit positive marginal cost for additional user. For example, the case of free or subsidized education, inoculation, etc. Free or subsidized education is given to few on the basis of merit. All people who wish to go for free education cannot be given free or subsidized education, so it is excludable and partially rival in consumption. These goods, they have to be given on certain merits. If one student is to be given free or subsidized education, which simply means that government has to incur the extra expenditure. So, in the case of merit goods, the cost of providing the additional good on the basis of merit, it exhibits positive marginal cost. Public revenue. Public revenue refers to the source of income to the government from the entire sources. The main sources of public revenue are taxes and non-taxes sources. Tax sources are those which comes from taxes, from direct and indirect taxes, and non-tax sources are those sources which comes from other sources apart from taxes. Now let's first discuss about the taxes. Taxes are the compulsory payments which are made by citizens of the country to the government. Taxes can be divided into two categories: direct tax and indirect tax. Two types of taxes: direct and indirect. Direct tax is a tax whose incidence and impact fall on the same person. Impact means the initial burden of the tax. It means who bear the burden of the tax in the first instance. Incidence of the tax refers to the final burden of the tax or who ultimately pays the tax. In direct taxes, the burden of tax cannot be shifted. For example, income tax, corporation tax, etc. On the other hand, indirect tax is a tax whose incidence and impact is on different person. The burden of the tax can be shifted onto another person. Example, sales tax. In the case of sales tax, impact is on the seller of the product, but the seller shifts the burden to the consumer, and it is the consumer who ultimately pays the tax or who bears the burden. Non-tax sources. There are different types of non-tax sources through which the government collects public revenue. These are fees, fines and penalties, grants and gifts, and surpluses from public enterprises, and many others. Let's discuss them. Fees. A fee is charged by public authorities for giving certain services to its citizens. For example, fee for making the driving licenses. Fines and penalties. Fines and penalties, they are imposed as a form of punishment or as a form for non-compliance with the government rules. Fines are also quid pro quo, which means that you do not get anything in return for paying fines and penalties. Example could be your traffic challans, which are cut by the traffic police if you break the signal. Similarly, grants and gifts. Government also collects grants and gifts from various sources. They can be internal, they can be external. For example, foreign aid, the food aid, etc. Then the surpluses of public enterprises. Some of the public enterprises, they perform well, so they earn revenue and they also earn profit. So the profit which the government gets from these profit making public enterprises also form the part of the public revenue or government revenue, and it's form the part of non-tax source. On the basis of relationship between tax rate and tax base, there are four different types of taxes: progressive, proportional, regressive, and digressive. Now let's discuss the case of progressive tax, regressive tax, and proportional tax. Progressive tax. A tax is called progressive tax in which the tax rate increases as the taxable amount increases, or the tax rate increases with the tax base increase. Income tax is one of the famous progressive tax. As you move on the higher income brackets, the tax rate also increases. Second, the regressive tax. A regressive tax is a tax in which the tax rate decreases as tax base increases. For example, if there is a tax of rupee 1 on one packet of say X commodity, and if person has income of rupees 10, then the tax which he will pay will rupees 1, and it will represent the 10% of the person's income. However, if the other person's income is rupees 20, then this rupee 1 will represent 5% of that person's income. So this tax is regressive. That means the tax rate decreases as the tax base increases. And the third is proportional tax. Proportional tax is a tax under which the tax rate is the same at each level of tax base. The tax rate remains same, but the tax amount increases as the person's income increases. For example, if the tax rate is 10% and person's income is rupees 50,000, the tax amount will be rupees 5,000, and if the individual income is rupees 1 lakh, he will pay rupees 10,000. Now the budget. Government budget is the statement of the estimated receipts and expenditure of the government during a fiscal year. There are different objectives behind the budget. One is the reallocation of the resources, because the resources, they are scarce, the need of the public are unlimited, the work which the government has to do unlimited, so it need to reallocate the resources into different parts and categories. Second, and the most important, is the to reduce the inequalities in income and wealth via budget and its taxation and subsidized policies. These inequalities can be reduced. Then to achieve the economic stability, then to achieve economic growth and economic development, and similarly many more objectives. Government budget. Government budget can be divided into two parts: revenue budget and capital budget. Revenue budget is related with revenue receipts and revenue expenditure. On the other hand, capital expenditure is related with capital revenue or capital receipts and capital expenditure. Now let us discuss about revenue receipts and revenue expenditure. Revenue receipts are those receipts which cannot be reclaimed from the government. These receipts neither create any liability to the government nor leads to loss of the capital to the government. Revenue receipts are further of two types: tax receipts and non-tax receipts. Tax receipts accrue through various direct and indirect taxes, which has been discussed in our paragraph. Similarly, non-tax receipts are like interest receipts on account of loans by the central government, dividends and profits on investment made by the government, fees and other receipts for services rendered by the government, etc. On the other hand, revenue expenditure are current or consumption expenditure incurred on civil administration, defense forces, public health and education, maintenance of government machinery. This type of expenditure is of recurring type, which is incurred year after year. Now let's talk about capital receipts and capital expenditure. Capital receipts are those receipts of the government which leads to creation of certain liability or reduction in its assets. Example of capital receipts are loans raised by the government from the public, loans raised by a borrowing from Reserve Bank of India, loans received from various international organizations or foreign countries. Similarly, capital expenditure is the expenditure which is incurred by the government, which leads to creation of physical or financial assets or reduction in financial liabilities. Example of capital expenditure is expenditure on infrastructure, investment in shares, etc. Both revenue and capital expenditure can further be classified into planned and non-planned categories. Now let us talk about balanced and unbalanced budget. Government budget can further be classified as balanced budget and unbalanced budget. Balanced budget is that budget in which government revenue is equal to government expenditure. Unbalanced budget is that budget in which government revenue is not equal to government expenditure. Under unbalanced budget, there can be two situations. Either the budget can be surplus or budget can be deficit. Different types of deficits. Now, before discussing the different types of deficits in the budget, let us try to make a sense that what is the meaning of budget deficit or deficit in the budget. Deficit in the budget accrues when revenue falls short of expenditure. There are different types of deficits which are discussed, like budget deficit, revenue deficit, fiscal deficit, and primary deficit. Primary deficit. Primary deficit is defined as the fiscal deficit minus interest payment. Public debt. Public debt refers to the loans which are raised by the government from within the country or outside the country. Public debt is an important source of public finance and it carries obligations of repayment to the individuals, institutions, along with rate of interest. Need of public debt. Now, the ultimate question arises that why government needs public debt? Public debt is needed on number of occasions like financing economic development in the times of natural calamities, wars, to cover budget deficits, financing 5-year or annual plans for pulling the economy out of the recession or depression, to control inflation, and many other purposes. Sources of public debt. Now the question comes, from where the government borrows, or what are the different sources of public debt? There are primarily two sources of public debt: internal and external. Now let's talk in more detail about the two sources of public debt, that are internal sources and external sources. When the debt is borrowed from internal sources, it becomes internal debt, and when it's borrowed from external sources, it becomes external debt. Internal debt is the loan taken by the government within the political boundaries of the country. The main sources of internal borrowings are individuals, banking and non-banking institutions, and the central bank of the country. External sources forms the external debt. It refers to the loans which are raised by the government from foreign or external sources. The main sources are foreign governments, foreign monetary institutions like World Bank, International Monetary Fund, international finance corporations, International Development Association, and etc. Now let us summarize what we have discussed in this module. We started with the meaning and the scope of public finance. Then we moved on to different functions and role of the government. Those were allocative, distributive, and stabilization. Then the meaning of public expenditure and what are the different principles or canons of public expenditure. Then we moved on to the public revenue, the sources of public revenue, tax and non-tax revenue, then direct indirect taxes, budget and its various types, and then similarly the different type of budgets, for example budget deficit, fiscal deficit, and revenue deficit. And in the last we discussed about the public debt and the two sources of public debt, that is internal as well as the external.